HTML 1.0 was simply HTML 4.01 reformulated according to the rules of XML. So you know the rules of XML. All the elements have to be lowercase, all the attributes have to be lowercase, they have to be quoted, you have to have closing tags on standalone elements, right? Stuff like that. And that was actually quite handy because it sort of enforced a coding style. If you used the doc-type XHTML 1.0 instead of HTML4, then suddenly the validator became a more powerful tool. Because the validator was going to tell you, oh, you forgot to code an attribute, or oh, you wrote that element in an uppercase rather than lowercase. So it was really good at enforcing a coding style. From the point of view of a browser, however, it really didn't make any difference. Right? It didn't matter whether you're using HTML 4.01 or 3.2. It didn't matter if you're using XHTML 1.0. To a browser, it's all the same. So really, there wasn't anything new in XHTML 1.0. It was more the benefit of best practices that it brought to the table. Then XHTML 1.1 came out, 2001. And that added just one small change, but it was an important change. Whereas in XHTML 1.0, you could still serve your content as HTML. That was allowed in the specification. Serve it as HTML or serve it as XML if you want. But nobody's going to serve it as XML, right? Well, in XHTML 1.1, you have to serve it as XML. You have to send the MIME type application/XML. This is a problem. First, it's a problem because the most popular browser on the planet at the time, Internet Explorer, simply can't handle XML, right? Doesn't know what to do with it if you send a proper XML document. Secondly, there's a problem with how XML handles things. Draconian error handling. This means that if a browser is parsing an XML document as opposed to an HTML document, the moment it sees a single error, it must stop parsing. So if you've ever actually tried to serve XHTML 1.1 as XML and then you've opened up the page in Firefox, right, and there's one single unencoded ampersand, you get the yellow screen of death. Okay? That is the correct behavior. Firefox is following the specification correctly, that it came across an error and it stopped parsing. This clearly doesn't fit with the web, right? With putting this stuff out there to users, that's just very brittle. But the W3C were set on this path, and they were even taking it further with the next version, XHTML2, which went even further than XHTML 1.1 and was going to break backwards compatibility with previous versions of HTML. They were talking about a whole new vocabulary. It was going to be, I mean, theoretically, fantastic. Theoretically, this beautiful language, everything's been thought through, but practically, it just couldn't work. At one point, they were talking about deprecating the image element, right? Just using object for everything. It just wasn't that practical. And the reason why this is problematic, the reason why XHTML2 could never work, the reason why XHTML 1.1, serving HTML as XML, could never work is down to a design principle that's underlying the internet, and that's Postel's law, right? To be conservative in what you send, be liberal in what you accept. The parsing model for XML with the draconian error handling is definitely not liberal in what it accepts. And browsers have to follow Postel's law. Browsers have to be liberal in what they accept because frankly what they're given to work with is pretty crap. Okay, most pages out there on the web are not good. Browsers have to work with that. And to come up with a theoretically beautiful language that fails on the first error is just not practical because of Postel's law. So, we get to HTML5. W3C are set down this path of XML. XML is the future. XHTML2, that's going to be the next version of the language of the web. HTML is done. Well, there was a face-to-face meeting, a working group meeting in 2004, and a bunch of members of the W3C, representatives from browser makers, said, look, let's revive HTML. Okay, there's representatives from Opera and Mozilla and Apple, and they said, I think if we just add a few more elements, you know, update forms a bit more, we can really enhance HTML, make it work better for web applications. Right? This is when web applications are really starting to take off. And there's still life in the old girl yet, right? And they had a vote at this meeting, and the W3C voted no. XHTML2 is the way. So these people went away and formed their own group. Not a standards body as such, just a group. And they called themselves the Web Hypertext Application Technology Working Group. Or what, WG. So they just start putting this out there. They start putting it together and building on fairly pragmatic ideas. And because they're browser makers, right, the WhatWG is essentially formed of browser makers, they're implementing this stuff. This isn't some theoretical thing. They actually are building it and putting it out there in their browsers. And then an interesting thing happened. The W3C, after a few years, turned around and said, you know what, we were wrong. Tim Berners-Lee wrote a blog post in 2006 where he said, yeah, it was unrealistic of us to expect the whole web to switch over to XML. I mean, maybe someday, it'd be nice, but it's just not going to happen. So let's renew the charter for the HTML working group, the one that shut down in 1999. And that's what happened. In 2007, a new HTML working group was formed to work on a specification, a proper official W3C specification called HTML5. Now, the first question they had was, do we start from scratch? Or do we take this work that the WhatWG have been doing? The WhatWG have been working on what they initially called something called Web Applications 1.0 and Web Forms 2.0, and it all kind of got lumped together under this kind of buzzwordy term called HTML5. Okay, so it came to be known as HTML5. And the W3C said, well, it makes sense if we actually take what they've started with and we work together on this. So that's what they did. And it also made sense, they took a vote on this, that there should be the same editor for both specifications because it's essentially one specification. So Ian Hickson, who was the editor over at the WhatWG, became the editor for HTML5 at the W3C. And that's pretty much the situation today, is you've got these two bodies, these two groups, working on essentially one specification. And it's kind of like the odd couple, like how will they ever get on? Because they have some very different ideas about how to get stuff done. For example, at the WhatWG, it's essentially a dictatorship, in that Ian Hickson's the editor, he listens to what everybody has to say, and then do what he thinks is best, right? Meanwhile, over to W3C, it's absolutely, democracy. We all vote on it, and you need, an absolute majority to get stuff done. Now, on the face of it, the way that WhatWG works sounds terrible, right? It sounds like that's a dreadful way to get anything done. And the W3C way sounds really fair and democratic. In practice, the WhatWG way actually works really well because of Ian Hickson. If it was anyone else, I don't think it would work as well. But he is actually incredibly fair, and he will listen to all sides, and he genuinely wants to do the best thing. And the W3C way, fair as it is and democratic as it is, it tends to take a long time to get anything done, and everything gets bogged down in procedure and politics and voting. So there's probably a middle ground between the two, which is kind of a sweet spot for getting a specification made. And because it's kind of such a tricky thing to get such differing bodies working together on the same spec, as well as having the specification HTML, what they really need to think about was the design of HTML5, which is what we're looking at today. So you've got a URL with a specification, this is HTML5, you have another URL with the design principles. And the purpose of these design principles is to enable these two groups to work together. They have this one vision about what is in the spec, how the spec gets to be made, where you prioritize things within the spec. And you see that, again, the watchwords here are compatibility, utility, interoperability. And if they can agree on that, then they've got common ground and they can get this thing working, they can get this thing made. So it's worth having a look at these design principles. And I'd like to go through, I'll just cherry pick a few design principles from this document and illustrate how they're being used to make HTML5. So here's one, very simple. Avoid needless complexity. Okay, seems pretty straightforward. Let me show you an example of avoiding needless complexity in HTML5. In HTML 4.01, let's say, okay, I'm writing a new HTML document. I begin with the doc type. Has anybody got that memorized? Because I don't, right? And this is why I don't have it memorized. You have to write this up, okay? Years I've been writing HTML. I've never memorized this. Likewise, with XHTML 1.0, which is the doc type I've been using for the last 10 years, because of the strictness, I like that strictness. I still haven't memorized the doc type for that, because it's this, right? This is why we have templates in our text editors, and this is why we have Google to look things up, so we don't have to memorize this stuff. It is kind of